Val9 had done this 412 times. He knew the exact number because he kept a log, not because the Dominion required it, not because anyone had ever asked to see it. He kept it because he was precise, and precise things were logged, and that was simply the way the universe worked. 412 worlds assessed. 412 entries in a small file that sat in the corner of his navigation system, next to the fuel calculations and the star maps. Clean, ordered, within acceptable parameters. The 413th world was blue. He noticed that first, not the size, not the orbital distance, not the temperature readings that came scrolling across his scanner panel. The color. It was blue the way deep water is blue. The way something looks when light goes into it and something else entirely comes back out. He had seen blue worlds before. Ice worlds mostly. Cold things with nothing living on them, nothing worth cataloging. This one was different. This one was blue and alive. Blue the way a thing is when it has decided to be that color on purpose. He pulled the ship into the shadow of a large gas giant, a fat, slow-turning thing with rings the color of old rust, and began his standard approach. This was procedure. You never came in close from open space. You tucked behind something big and you watched first. 412 worlds had taught him that watching first cost nothing. Moving too fast sometimes cost everything. The scanner ran its first pass. 14 flags came back. Val9 looked at the number. 14 was unusual. On most worlds, even the ones with life, even the ones with complex life, even the ones with what the Dominion classified as civilization, came back with 3 or 4 flags at most. 14 meant the scanner had found 14 things it did not know what to do with. He dismissed 12 of them. Pre-stellar worlds threw false positives all the time. The scanner was built for Dominion-level civilizations, for things that had reached at least the second tier of space travel, for species that had sorted themselves out enough to be worth a proper assessment. For primitive worlds, it flagged everything it didn't recognize, and it didn't recognize most things, because primitive worlds were strange and chaotic and full of noise that looked like signal until you looked closer. 12 flags dismissed. Or he had done this exact thing on 230 of his 412 assessments. 2 flags he left open. He looked at them for a moment, the way you look at a word you've read 100 times and suddenly are not sure how to spell. The first one read, Biological Variance Index 9.4. The scale ran from 0 to 10. 0 meant every member of a species was, biologically speaking, almost identical. 10 meant the variance within the species was so extreme that members could barely be classified as the same organism. Most advanced civilizations sat between 2 and 4. High variance meant evolutionary instability. High variance, in the Dominion's experience, usually meant a species that would fracture before it reached the stars. Val9 had never seen a reading above 6 on a world that still had a functioning civilization. 9.4. He noted it. He did not dismiss it. He moved to the second flag. Behavioral Homogeneity Index, 0.1. He read this twice. The Behavioral Homogeneity Index measured how similarly members of a species acted when faced with the same situation. A score of 100 meant perfect uniformity. Every member responding the same way, following the same patterns, making the same choices. Most successful civilizations sat between 60 and 80. High homogeneity meant a species that had agreed, however loosely, on how to be. Low homogeneity meant chaos, 0.1. He had never seen a score below 12. 0.1 meant that if you put 1,000 members of this species in identical situations, you would get 1,000 different responses. It meant the species had no behavioral consensus whatsoever, no shared pattern, no common logic that ran underneath the surface and made them predictable. He filed both flags under interesting and moved on. He was good at moving on. It was part of what made him effective. You did not get to 412 assessments by sitting in the shadow of a gas giant, turning data points over in your hands like worry stones. You noted, you filed, you continued. He ran the passive intercept. This was always the most informative part of a pre-contact assessment. You did not go to the surface. You did not reveal yourself. You simply listened to whatever the species was broadcasting outward. And every civilization that had reached a certain level of technology broadcast something outward, whether it meant to or not. Radio waves, electromagnetic signals, the noise of being alive and organized and talking to yourself. The planet was talking to itself, loudly. The volume of the signal was the first thing that hit him, not loud in the way sound is loud, but loud in the way a crowd is loud when you open a door, and suddenly they are all right there. His equipment recalibrated automatically. He had it set to handle Dominion-level broadcast ranges, which were significant. The planet blew past his calibration ceiling inside 2 seconds and kept going. Millions of signals, simultaneous, not thousands, millions, all running at the same time, crossing each other, layering over each other, filling every available frequency with noise and structure and pattern. He had never heard anything like it. Even Dominion core worlds, with their vast communication networks and their billions of citizens all connected to the same infrastructure, even those worlds did not produce this density of signal. This planet was producing the communication equivalent of everyone on the world trying to talk to everyone else at the same exact second. And somehow, beneath all of it, each signal was distinct. He sat with it for a while. The gas giant turned outside his window, slow and indifferent. He ran the translation algorithm on the strongest signal he could isolate. The algorithm was not perfect on unknown languages. Nothing was. But it was good enough. It had cracked 412 languages, or enough of them to be useful. It needed time and volume. The planet was giving it both. While it worked, he ran the rest of the standard assessment. EU population count came back first. The number was large, not extraordinary by Dominion standards. He had cataloged worlds with 10 times this number, but healthy, a successful species. The population was concentrated in large clusters across most of the planet's landmasses, with smaller clusters almost everywhere else. Even the cold parts, even the wet parts, even the parts that the atmospheric scans showed as barely survivable. They were in the deserts. They were in the mountains. They were on the small cold islands at the top and bottom of the world. They were everywhere. He noted this, filed it, continued. Technology scan came back in pieces because the technology was uneven. Some parts of the world were significantly more advanced than others. Some areas had dense electromagnetic infrastructure, power grids, our communication networks, the signatures of heavy industry. Other areas had almost nothing. The planet was not a single civilization in the way the Dominion understood civilizations. It was many civilizations, many separate groups, all sharing the same rock and breathing the same air, and operating at different levels of development simultaneously. This was not unusual for pre-stellar worlds. It was actually quite common. Species usually consolidated eventually under one government or one dominant power before they reached the stars. The uneven development would sort itself out. It always did. He filed it and moved on. The translation algorithm chimed softly. He turned to it. Confidence rating, 97%. That was high. When that was actually very high for a first pass on an unknown language. Usually he got 70% on the first run and had to let it refine over several cycles before it got reliable. 97% meant the language was, structurally speaking, not particularly complex. Straightforward grammar, consistent patterns, the kind of language a translation algorithm liked. He read the content. He read it again. He turned away from the screen and looked at the gas giant for a long moment. He turned back and read it a third time. The signal he had isolated was not a government broadcast. It was not a military transmission. It was not a news report or an official communication of any kind. It was, as best as he could determine, something the species produced for entertainment, a recreation of historical events, moving images with sound, now designed to be watched and listened to, designed to tell a story. The story was about a war, not a small war, not a border conflict or a regional dispute, or the kind of low-level fighting that pre-stellar species engaged in constantly without it meaning very much. This was a large war, a world-scale war. The translation gave him numbers. He checked them against the population data and felt something shift in the back of his mind in a way he did not immediately have a word for. The numbers were significant. The numbers were, relative to total population, catastrophic. And the tone of the transmission was not horror. He ran the tone analysis twice because the first result seemed wrong. The algorithm analyzed linguistic markers, vocal patterns, the emotional weight of the words, and it came back with a result he had seen before. High, but not in this context. Not when discussing this scale of death. Pride, grief, both, simultaneously. He flagged this for manual review because the algorithm was not built to handle both at once. You were supposed to pick one. The algorithm wanted him to resolve the ambiguity, to decide which reading was correct. He left it flagged. He sat in the dark of the cockpit and pulled up the historical database he carried with him. A compressed record of every civilization the Dominion had cataloged, every species assessed, every world that had been through the standard subjugation process. 412 entries. He knew this database the way you know your own house, the way you can walk through it in the dark without hitting anything because you have always known where everything is. He searched for a comparable case, a species that had made entertainment out of its own catastrophic wars. The database returned nothing. He searched for species that had archived their own worst moments and distributed them to the entire population as a matter of course. Nothing. He searched for species that had experienced world-scale conflict and then documented it with this level of detail in this particular emotional combination, pride and grief, both at once, and made it something that other members of the species watch by choice in their homes for something to do. Nothing, nothing, nothing. He leaned back in his seat. Outside, the gas giant moved its slow rings through the dark. He thought about the 412 worlds before this one. He thought about how many of them had experienced serious internal conflict before the Dominion arrived. Most had. It was almost a universal trait, the tendency of intelligent species to fight among themselves before they figured out how to stop. The Dominion had files on all of it. Wars that had ended centuries before contact. Wars that had ended decades before. A handful still flickering at the edges when the assessment ships arrived. He thought about what all of those species had in common. They were ashamed of it. Not openly, not always. But the records showed it. The suppression, the mythology, the way history got smoothed and softened and turned into something more comfortable over time. Species did not, as a rule, like to look directly at what they had done to each other. They built monuments and held ceremonies and called it remembrance. But the actual records, the actual numbers, the actual footage, they buried it, quietly. And collectively, the way you push something to the back of a drawer and stop opening that drawer. This planet had put it on broadcast, in millions of signals, simultaneously, available to anyone who could receive it. He pulled up the intercept log and counted the transmissions that the algorithm had flagged as historically focused. The number was not small. The number was, in fact, larger than the number of transmissions focused on any other single subject. This species had more transmissions about its own past conflicts than about anything else. More than entertainment, more than science, more than any of the other categories the algorithm used. They were obsessed with what they had survived. He opened a new scan, not the passive intercept, but a deeper historical pull, an active reach back through the planet's broadcast history, as far as the signal trail went. This was not standard procedure. Standard procedure was the passive intercept, the standard assessment flags, the report. He had done standard procedure 412 times. He ran the deep scan. It took 3 hours. He waited. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He watched the gas giant turn and he waited and he thought about the 2 flags he had left open, the ones he had not dismissed, the 9.4 and the 0.1, and he thought about what they meant together. Extreme biological variance, near zero behavioral homogeneity, every individual different, every individual unpredictable, not just a few members of the species, not an outlier population in a specific region, every single one. The scanner had been clear. When it said 0.1, it meant that across the entire planet, across every one of those millions of simultaneous signals, across every cluster of civilization, from the warm parts to the cold islands at the edges of the world, there was no common pattern. There was no single logic underneath it all. that you could learn and then use to predict what they would do. The deep scan finished. He looked at the results for a long time. The broadcast record went back approximately 120 years. The age of their radio technology, which was young, which was exactly what you expected from a pre-stellar world. 120 years of transmissions, compressed and indexed and laid out in front of him. The pattern was immediately visible. They had never stopped fighting, not once, not for any significant stretch of time, not across the whole planet simultaneously. In any given decade of the 120-year record, there were between 4 and 30 distinct armed conflicts running in different parts of the world at the same time. Some were small, some were not. The world-scale ones stood out in the data like bright red marks on a map. 2 of them separated by roughly 20 years, during which the entire planet had been involved, during which the numbers had been staggering, during which the scars had run deep enough that they were still broadcasting about it 60 years later. And then, he found the piece of data that made him stop moving entirely. After the second world-scale conflict, the larger of the 2, the one that had produced the numbers that had shifted something in the back of his mind, after all of that, after the deaths that the data showed and the damage that the scans reflected in the still visible infrastructure gaps across certain regions of the planet, after all of that, he tracked the recovery curve. 40 years later, they had split the atom. He knew what that meant. Every species-level assessor knew what that meant. Atomic energy was a threshold. It meant a civilization had reached the point where it could, if it chose, end itself entirely. The Dominion watched for it. The Dominion had a specific protocol for worlds that had reached that threshold, because worlds at that threshold were volatile, because a species that could end itself from the inside was a species that required careful handling. 40 years after the worst conflict in their recorded history, they had reached that threshold. He kept reading. So 30 years after that, they were in space. Not far. Not far by any meaningful measure. Just their own moon. Just the first small steps off the rock they had always lived on. But they were there. They had gone from the worst recorded catastrophe in their history to standing on another world in 70 years. He sat with that number. 70 years. He thought about other species he had assessed that had experienced comparable catastrophes. He thought about what the recovery curves looked like. He thought about the ones that had recovered at all, because many hadn't. Many had collapsed inward after a serious enough blow. Many had spent centuries just getting back to where they were before. He thought about the fastest recovery he had seen in 412 assessments. It was not 70 years. It was not close to 70 years. He opened the direct transmission channel to High Command. This was also not standard procedure. Standard procedure was to complete the full assessment, compile the report, transmit it at the end of the cycle. You did not open a direct channel mid-assessment. You did not interrupt the process. He had never once, in 412 assessments, opened a direct channel mid-assessment. He opened it, and then he did not transmit anything. He sat with his hand over the transmit key, and he looked at the channel open in front of him, and he thought about what he was going to say. He was a precise man. He did not transmit things before he knew how to say them precisely. He was going to transmit this correctly, or he was not going to transmit it at all. He closed the channel. He looked at his secondary antenna array. There was a calibration reading on the secondary array that was technically slightly off, within acceptable parameters, but slightly off, the kind of thing you could tighten up in a few minutes with a manual adjustment. He got up from his seat and went to the maintenance panel and took out the calibration tool and began adjusting the bolt on the secondary array housing. He tightened it. He checked the reading, loosened it slightly, checked again. Within acceptable parameters. He went back to his seat. He looked at the planet, still blue, still turning below him, still pouring its millions of signals outward into the dark without knowing he was there. He thought about one specific thing he had read in the translated transmission. One line, one near the end of the historical documentary, the entertainment piece, the one made about the worst war on the planet's record. Near the end, after the numbers and the footage and the grief and the pride all mixed together in a way his algorithm still had not resolved. Near the end, there had been a single line of narration. The algorithm had rated it 97% confidence. It translated cleanly. It said, We will not let this be forgotten so that we will never let it happen again. He had read that sentence in 230 historical archives, on 230 different worlds, about 230 different conflicts. Then he pulled up the rest of the scan. They had said it after the First World War. They had said it again, louder after the Second, and the conflicts had continued. And not because they were lying. He ran the sincerity markers and they were off the chart. Every time they said it, they meant it completely. Every time they archived it and broadcast it and made entertainment about it and taught it to their children, they meant every word. And the conflicts continued anyway. Because meaning it and stopping it were, for this species, two completely separate things. Because they were made of zero point 0.1 behavioral homogeneity, which meant the one who started the next conflict was not the one who had said those words, was not operating on the same logic, was not reachable by the same reasoning. They kept the record, they kept the grief, they kept the pride, and they kept going. He opened the direct transmission channel to High Command again. This time he transmitted. He did not transmit the standard report. He transmitted 4 words, which was almost nothing, which was the smallest transmission he had ever sent in 412 assessments. Do not proceed yet. Then he closed the channel and sat back and looked at the planet and thought about the fact that somewhere down there, right now, someone was probably fighting someone else. And someone else was probably helping a stranger they had never met. And someone else was looking up at the sky and wondering if anything was out there. All 3, simultaneously. He was almost certain of it. The gas giant turned. The blue planet turned. Val 9 sat very still and thought about the word parameters and how it only meant something if the thing you were measuring agreed to stay inside it. This planet did not look like something that agreed to stay inside anything. He added a second line to the transmission. We need to talk about what we're doing here. Then he sat in the dark and waited for someone to answer. High Command took 11 hours to respond. Val 9 spent 8 of those hours going through the transmission archive, and 1 of them eating a meal he did not taste, and 2 of them sitting completely still with his eyes open and his hands flat on his knees, not sleeping, not reading, not doing anything that had a name. When the response came, it was short. Proceed with standard assessment. Transmit full report at cycle end. Flag reason for early contact. He read it 3 times. He flagged the reason for early contact as data anomaly, requiring command attention, and then went back to the archive. He was not going to argue with High Command over a preliminary flag. He was going to show them. He pulled the full translated archive onto his main screen and started from the oldest available transmission. The first thing he noticed was the sheer variety of it. In his 412 assessments, he had encountered species that communicated primarily in images, species that communicated primarily in sound, species that used physical chemical signals and had to be studied through secondary recordings. This species used all of these things simultaneously. Their transmissions contained moving images, spoken language, written language, music, and dozens of other signal types he was still categorizing. They had apparently decided at some point that one format was not enough, that the thing they were trying to say required every tool they had all at once. He started with the ones the algorithm had flagged as historical. They were not what he expected. He had seen historical records from dozens of pre-stellar species during assessments. They followed a pattern. The oldest ones were usually simple. Primitive recordings, rough images, basic narration. As the technology improved, the records improved, and the content, regardless of what the specific history was, tended to follow a similar emotional logic. The wins were celebrated. The losses were explained away or blamed on external forces or quietly minimized. The leaders were portrayed as wise. The enemies were portrayed as wrong. The arc of history, in every species' own telling, bent toward the current civilization being correct. These did not do that. The records showed wins and losses in the same tone. The leaders were shown making catastrophic decisions and suffering the consequences with no softening of the truth. The enemies were given names and faces, and sometimes, particularly in the later records, voices, full interviews, full perspectives, entire transmissions dedicated to understanding the logic of the other side. The species appeared to have a deeply ingrained compulsion to argue both sides of its own history simultaneously, even when the argument was uncomfortable, even when the answer reflected poorly on everyone involved. He found a transmission that was several hours long, the algorithm estimated it, dedicated entirely to a single battle from the Second World Scale conflict. He ran a sample translation. The translation showed a narrator describing what happened with precise numbers in unsparing language. Then the transmission spent an equal amount of time on the other side of that battle. The soldiers who had done the thing being described, their names, their reasons, their fear. He ran the sincerity index on both halves. Both read as sincere. The production team had approached both sides with equal weight. They had not softened either. He sat with this for a while. The Dominion had its own historical records. He had studied them during his training. They were extensive and detailed and uniformly proud. The Dominion's history, in the Dominion's own telling, was a clean line from small beginning to great empire, marked by wise decisions and necessary conflicts, and the steady expansion of order into a chaotic galaxy. He had never once in his entire education been shown a record that gave equal weight to the perspective of a world the Dominion had subjugated. He was not sure such a record existed. He moved on to the aggression index. He ran the archive through the standard tool. The tool was calibrated for Dominion-level civilizations, meaning it expected to see conflict data in the range of 1 to 800 on its internal scale. It was designed to identify species that posed active threats to Dominion forces during subjugation, species with organized military capability, with weapons of significant destructive power, with the social cohesion to mount a sustained resistance. The tool returned 2,340. He stared at the number. He ran it again. The tool returned an error the second time, which meant the input had exceeded its designed range. So he overrode the error protocol and forced a third run. The number came back the same, 2,340. He had never seen a number above 900. 900 was a species that had been in an active war with its neighbors at the time of Dominion contact, fully mobilized, with functioning weapons systems and combat-hardened military units. That species had been subjugated in 4 months. He was not sure what 2,340 meant in practical terms because the tool had never been designed to mean anything above 1,000. He set it aside and looked at the raw data instead. The weapons were the first thing. Prestellar species typically had weapons capable of destroying buildings. Sometimes small areas, sometimes large areas if the technology was advanced enough. The Second World-Scale conflict had introduced weapons capable of destroying entire cities in a single event. Not over the course of a battle, not over days or weeks of sustained bombardment. One event, one moment. He found the record of the first use of such a weapon. He found the record of the second use 3 days later. And then he found what happened after. The species had not used those weapons in conflict again. Not in the 70-plus years since. They had built more of them. Many more than was remotely necessary for any tactical purpose, and so had their adversaries, and so had other nations that followed, until the total number of such weapons on the planet was capable of ending all life on the surface many times over. And then they had just kept them in silos, in submarines, on aircraft. Ready, mild always ready, never used. He ran this through the logic framework he used for strategic assessment, and the framework returned something he had never seen it return before. The framework was built on the premise that weapons exist to be used, that accumulation indicates intention, that stockpiling at this scale represented an explicit threat that would eventually be acted upon. The framework flagged the situation as terminally unstable, and yet the weapons had not been used for over 70 years. He pushed the framework aside and thought about it without tools. The species had built enough weapons to kill themselves completely. They had pointed those weapons at each other across decades of rising and falling tensions. They had come close. He found records of specific moments when the closest they got to using those weapons could be measured in minutes, in single decisions made by specific individuals in specific rooms. He read about one such moment in detail. The decision not to act had been made by one person. One person working from incomplete information, in the middle of the night, had chosen not to report what looked like an incoming strike on his country's territory. His name was in the record. They had named him. They had found him decades later and asked him why he had made that choice. He said it had seemed wrong, not tactically wrong, not strategically wrong, just wrong, a feeling. He had looked at the data and he had felt, in whatever way his species felt things, that it was wrong, and so he had not pressed the button. Hush, Val 9 read this 3 times. An empire's worth of weapons, decades of tension, the fate of the species in the hands of one man's feeling that something seemed wrong, and the man had been right. He moved on. He had to move on. He had the feeling of something pulling at the edge of his mind the way a loose thread pulls at the edge of fabric, and if he kept pulling it, everything was going to come apart, and he needed to finish the assessment. He got to the economy next. This was usually one of the simpler parts. You looked at resource extraction, at production, at distribution networks. You identified where the wealth was concentrated. It was always concentrated in every species. That was a universal truth of intelligent life. And you identified the systems that kept it concentrated, and you noted it and moved on. What the economy was strange, not the concentration of wealth. That was exactly as expected, exactly the same pattern he had seen 412 times. What was strange was what ran alongside it. The same species that had spent centuries building empires on the labor of other populations had also, during those same centuries, built something the translation algorithm rendered as charity. Voluntary systems, people taking what they had earned and giving portions of it to people they had never met and would never meet, with no expectation of return. At scale, he ran the numbers. The scale was not trivial. It was not a peripheral behavior, not something a small group of individuals did that could be noted as an outlier. It was woven into the structure of their civilization, institutionalized in some regions, informal in others, but present everywhere. In the same world where people died of preventable causes because resources were concentrated in too few hands, other people spent their entire lives moving resources to the ones who were dying. Both things, simultaneously, not in conflict with each other in any way the species seemed interested in resolving. They just ran both systems at the same time, the extraction and the giving, the damage and the repair. He noted it. He did not have a framework that could hold it, so he just noted it and put it in the file and kept moving. He was 3/4 through the archive when he found the transmission that stopped him completely. It was recent. The algorithm placed it within the last 20 years, which made it nearly contemporary, which meant it reflected the species as it currently existed rather than as it had been. It was long, longer than most of what he had reviewed. The algorithm classified it as documentary, medical, which he had not yet reviewed any of. He had been prioritizing the historical and conflict records. He opened it. It was about a disease, not a weapon, not a conflict, a disease, a small biological thing that had moved through the world's population across several years and killed a significant number of people and disrupted the civilizations of the entire planet in ways the record captured in detail. He watched the way the species had responded to it. He expected what he always saw in these situations. In his 412 assessments, he had seen species respond to plagues with varying degrees of competence, but the basic social behavior was consistent. The strong protected themselves first. The systems that existed protected the people those systems were built to serve. Everyone else managed as best they could. The transmission showed something more complicated. There were failures, large ones, visible ones, cases where systems that should have protected people had not, where resources that should have been shared had been hoarded, where the behavior he expected appeared exactly as he expected it. He noted those without surprise. But running alongside those failures at the same time, in the same world, something else. Individuals and groups moving toward the danger instead of away from it. Medical workers going into places they knew were dangerous. Supply chains being organized by volunteers who had no obligation to do so. Much people in one part of the world sending resources to strangers in another part. All of it informal, all of it unprompted. All of it running on the same engine he had seen in the disaster records and the war records and the charity data. This thing the species did where they saw a problem and could not stop themselves from trying to fix it, even when fixing it cost them personally, even when the person the problem was happening to was a stranger. He paused the transmission. He sat back. He thought about the assessment framework. The framework had clear guidance for species showing high internal conflict. It rated them as easier to subjugate because internal conflict meant division, and division meant you could use one part of the species against another. You offered safety to the part that was losing. Honor, you offered resources to the part that was poor. You picked at the existing fractures and the things split from the inside. He thought about whether that framework applied here. He thought about a species that was simultaneously extracting from and repairing itself. That was simultaneously fighting and rescuing. That was simultaneously making weapons capable of ending all life and then not using them for 70 years because one man's feeling that something seemed wrong had saved everyone. The framework had been built on the premise that you could identify which part of a species to appeal to. This species did not divide into parts that way. The person doing the extracting and the person doing the repairing might be the same person on different days of the same week. The soldier in the conflict archive and the volunteer in the disaster relief footage might be the same age, the same background, operating on the same values, making different choices based on what? Context? Circumstance? One man's feeling that something seemed wrong. He could not draw a line through this species and say, this part we can use, this part we need to neutralize. The line would not hold. The line would move before he finished drawing it. He opened the direct channel to High Command again. He did not send the standard 4-word message this time. He wrote for 2 hours, which was the longest he had ever spent on a transmission, and what he wrote was not a report in any format he had been trained to use. It was something closer to a warning. He described the aggression index. He described the atomic weapons and the 70 years of not using them. He described the simultaneous drive to destroy and repair. He described the 0.1 behavioral homogeneity score and what it actually meant in practice. Not instability, not weakness, but the complete impossibility of predicting any individual member's response to pressure. He described the one man in the middle of the night who had felt it was wrong. He ended the transmission with a question he had never asked in 412 assessments. Have we ever subjugated a species that we could not, at any point, model? Have we ever proceeded against something that we genuinely could not predict? He sent it. He went back to the archive. There was one more thing he had not reviewed yet. The algorithm had flagged a category he had been saving, one not out of strategy, but out of something he did not have a clean word for. The category was labeled children's media. He had been putting it off. He opened it now. The algorithm took a moment to select a sample, something short, something representative. It returned a transmission that was approximately 3 minutes long. A song. Simple melody. Designed, the algorithm noted, for very young members of the species. Early developmental stage, pre-literacy, the age when they were first learning to understand the world they had been born into. He played it. The melody was gentle, slow, the kind of sound a species makes when it is trying to put the very young at ease, when it is trying to say without complicated words, the world is safe, you are safe, everything is going to be all right. The translation came through cleanly. 97% confidence again. The same rating as everything else, because the language was the language, whether it was a war archive or a nursery song. It was about a child who fell down, not metaphorically. Literally fell down. A small creature, new to walking, trying to move through its environment and falling down repeatedly. The song was addressed to that child. It was narrating the falling and the getting up, falling, getting up, falling, getting up. The same loop, gentle and patient, set to a melody that was built to comfort. The last line translated as, that's what we do, not as instruction, not as encouragement, as statement of fact, as the deepest, most fundamental piece of information a species could choose to hand to its youngest members before they were old enough to understand history or conflict or atomic weapons or any of the rest of it. That's what we do. We fall, we get up, we fall again, we get up again. This is not a lesson. This is not something you learn. This is something you are. Val 9 sat very still for a long time. He thought about the 412 worlds in his log. He thought about the ones that had resisted. He thought about how long the resistance had lasted, because it always lasted a specific amount of time, because it always ran out eventually. The will to keep getting up was a resource like any other resource, and it depleted. And when it was gone, the world settled into the new order, and that was that. Harder, he thought about a species that was teaching its children before those children could read, before they could understand anything else. That getting up was not a choice or a strategy. It was just what they did. He was still sitting there when High Command responded to his second transmission. The response was short again, but the tone was different. He had worked for High Command for long enough to read tone in short transmissions, and the tone was different. It said, "Stand by." Escalating. He had never received that response before. He closed the archive. He looked at the planet below him, still blue, still turning, still loud with its millions of signals going out in every direction. Somewhere down there, a child was falling down for the first time, being told gently to music that this was not a problem, and that this was just the beginning. He added one more line to his case file in the personal notes section that High Command technically was not required to read. It said, "I do not think we have done this before. I think we are about to find out why." Then he waited. The gas giant turned outside his window. The blue planet turned. Vial 9 did not. The High Council of the Oran Dominion had not called an emergency session in 43 years. The last one had been to respond to the collapse of a border star system. A genuine military crisis, a fast-moving situation that required immediate decisions and could not wait for the standard cycle. Admiral Keth Sorn remembered it clearly. He had been younger then, which was not saying much because he was very old now, but he remembered the energy in the room. Sharp, focused. Oh, the council knew what it was dealing with. Everyone had a role. The decisions were made quickly and they were correct, and inside of 3 months the situation was resolved. He did not feel that energy in the room today. He felt something else, something slower and less comfortable. The kind of feeling a room gets when everyone in it has read the same thing, and no one wants to be the first to say what they're all thinking. There were 11 of them at the council table. Each represented a major division of the Dominion structure: military, intelligence, science, resources, colonial management, and so on. Each had served long enough that nothing, in theory, should be able to make them sit like this. Still, quiet. Eyes that kept moving to the report on the table in front of them, and then moving away again. Rana Keth Sorn had read the report 3 times before the session began. He had fought in 200 campaigns. He had given orders that ended civilizations. He had signed the final assessments on 41 worlds, which meant he had been the one to formally authorize the beginning of subjugation procedures. The signal fires, the first broadcasts, the removal of existing power structures. He had done it efficiently, and he had done it correctly, and he had not, until approximately 48 hours ago, questioned any of it in any meaningful way. He sat at the head of the table and looked at the report and kept his face very still. The session was called to order by the council's protocol officer, who announced the single agenda item in a voice that tried to be neutral and almost managed it. Assessment File 7-RN-03. Third planet, Usul System. Species, prestellar, carbon-based bilateral symmetry, approximate population. See attached data. He kept reading. The numbers were large. The flags were many. At the end of the reading, he set down the document and looked at the council and said, "Discussion is open." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then the director of colonial management, a broad-shouldered woman named Voss Elthen, who had overseen more successful planetary integrations than anyone else at the table, picked up the report. She had read it before the session. They all had, but she read it again now, a specific section, and then she put it down with a small, controlled movement that Keth Sorn recognized as the movement of someone being very careful not to slam something. She said, "We should get a second assessment." The head of intelligence, a quiet man called Dren, who had been head of intelligence for longer than anyone cared to calculate, said, "We already did." There was a pause. "The second assessor reached the same conclusions," Dren said. She appended a personal note. "I have included it in the secondary file." The secondary file passed around the table. Keth Sorn had already read it. The personal note from the second assessor was 4 sentences. It said she had checked the first assessor's mathematics, that she wished she hadn't, that the conclusions were correct, and that she believed the council should read the full archive before making any decisions. "Let's watch it," said the chief scientist. He was very young for his position. Young meaning he had only been alive for about 200 years, which at this table made him a junior member. And he had a habit of speaking when older people were still deciding whether to speak, which was either a strength or a failing, depending on the day. The documentary, let's watch it before we vote on anything. Keth Sorn approved of this, not because he hadn't watched it already, but because he wanted to watch the council watch it. They watched it. The room was very quiet for the entire duration. Keth Sorn watched his colleagues' faces more than he watched the screen. He saw the moment when Voss Elthen's jaw tightened. He saw the exact point at which Dren stopped taking notes. He saw the chief scientist stop fidgeting. The young man was always fidgeting, always moving, and he went absolutely still at the part with the numbers. And Keth Sorn made a note of the fact that it was the numbers that did it, not the footage. And the footage was terrible. The numbers were worse, because numbers did not have a face to look away from. The documentary ended. The screen went dark. Nobody spoke. After a while, the oldest member of the council, a woman named Sarath, who had been alive for 900 years and had the particular stillness of something that had been through everything and come out on the other side of surprise, said very quietly, "Play it again." They played it again. After the second viewing, Voss Elthen said, "We have a clear tactical advantage, orbital superiority. They have no awareness of our presence. We proceed on the accelerated timeline, minimize contact, minimize risk. Standard glass and reclaim procedure." Glass and reclaim was not the official term. The official term was environmental reset preceding managed colonization. Hey, but everyone at the table called it what it was, in private, because they had been doing this long enough to stop pretending that words change what a thing was. "From orbit," Voss Elthen continued, "no ground forces required, no contact, clean and fast." The representative from the resource division nodded. The representative from colonial management nodded. 2 others said nothing, but their body language said yes. "Wait," said the head of science, whose name was Pel Vaughn, and who was older than the chief scientist, but younger than anyone else at the table, and who had been quiet until now. "I want to make sure we are applying the correct risk framework before we vote." Voss Elthen turned to look at him. "The glass and reclaim option," Pel Vaughn said, "assumes the species cannot reach us at orbital distance. That is a valid assumption today. They are pre-stellar. They cannot leave their own system in any meaningful capacity. Their weapons, as currently deployed, cannot reach a ship in high orbit." He paused. "But I want us to be very clear about what the assessment is actually telling us, so I am going to say it out loud." No one stopped him. "The assessment is telling us that 70 years ago, this species was in the worst conflict of its recorded history. And 40 years after that, it had atomic weapons. And 30 years after that, it was in space. We are planning to act now, based on a technology gap that currently exists." He paused again. "How long does that gap stay in our favor? Because if we look at that recovery curve..." "The gap is sufficient," Voss Elthen said. "For now," Pel Vaughn said. "For now is when we're acting," she said. Keth Sorn had been watching all of this without saying anything. He did this in council sessions. He waited. He had learned over 200 campaigns that the shape of a situation became clearest if you waited to see how other people described it first. You learn more from watching people argue than from arguing yourself. He had learned what he needed to learn. He cleared his throat. The table went quiet in the way tables go quiet when the person who has fought in the most wars decides to speak. "I have a question," he said. "It is not a tactical question. I want to ask it anyway." He looked at Voss Elthen. He looked at Dren. He looked at all of them. "How many species," he said, "or in the 400-plus worlds we have brought into the Dominion, how many of them fought back?" The answer to this was large, and everyone at the table knew it. It was, in fact, the majority. Most species resisted at some point during the subjugation process. Resistance was expected. Resistance was planned for. The subjugation timeline included a resistance buffer, extra time and resources set aside specifically for the phase when the target species organized and pushed back. Most of them, Dren said, because Dren was the kind of person who answered questions directly. Most of them, Keth Sorn agreed. And how many of them are still fighting now? Silence. None, he said. Not one. Every species that has ever resisted Dominion subjugation has eventually stopped. Not because we killed all of them, because the will ran out. Because resistance is expensive and difficult, and people get tired, and the generation that remembers why they were fighting eventually gives way to the generation that only knows the world as it is. He paused. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. You wait it out. He picked up the report and held it up. This species, he said, has been in continuous conflict for 11,000 years of recorded history. They have never in that entire time stopped. Not once. Not for a single uninterrupted generation of peace. They have come close to ending themselves completely, multiple times, with weapons they built for exactly that purpose, and they have not stopped. They are currently in 3 separate armed conflicts as of the most recent intercept data. He set the report down. I want someone to explain to me, he said, very calmly, why those conflicts have not run out in 11,000 years. Because every other species' conflicts run out. That is the pattern. That is what happens. It runs out. So tell me why theirs doesn't. The room was quiet. Because they keep starting new ones, Voss Elton said. There is no continuous conflict. There are sequential conflicts. The old ones end and new ones begin. That is not the same as a species that cannot be worn down. That is a species that resets. Resets, Keth Sorn repeated. Yes. And when we begin subjugation procedures, he said, and they resist, and they will resist, because a species with this history will absolutely resist, what happens when that resistance runs out and they reset? Voss Elton stared at him. They'll start a new one, he said, against us. The room sat with this. Sepelvon was writing something. The chief scientist was no longer fidgeting. Sirath, the 900-year-old member who had been quiet since asking for the documentary to be replayed, was looking at the wall in a way that meant she was not looking at the wall. It was Dren who spoke next. I received an additional intercept this morning, he said. I was going to raise it after the initial discussion, but I think it belongs here. He paused. My analysis team has been pulling contemporary transmissions, current broadcasts, not archival, what the species is doing right now, today. He reached into his file and removed a small data card and set it on the table. This was captured 6 hours ago, he said. I had it translated before the session. It is a standard broadcast, something they transmit widely. We available to the whole population. It is not military. It is not political. He paused. It is what they give to their children. He played it. The melody was gentle. The words were simple. Keth Sorn listened to the translation and kept his face still and watched the room. He watched Voss Elton hear the last line. He watched Sarath close her eyes. He watched the chief scientist lean back in his chair and stare at the ceiling with the expression of someone who has just had an argument with themselves and lost. The transmission ended. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Voss Elton said, and her voice was different now slightly, not much but enough. This doesn't change the tactical reality. No, Keth Sorn said. It doesn't. He meant that. The tactical reality was clear. They had orbital superiority, and the species was pre-stellar. The window existed and it was real, and nothing he had said or the nursery song had said changed those facts. But I have been in this position 200 times, he said. 200 campaigns. And in all of those campaigns, there is a specific moment I remember. The moment just before we begin, when you look at the target world and you ask yourself, do I understand what this is? And if the answer is yes, if you genuinely understand what you're dealing with, then you proceed with confidence because the plan accounts for everything you know. He looked at the data card on the table. Does anyone at this table feel, he said slowly, that they genuinely understand what this is? Nobody answered. That was an answer. I want a full xenosociological analysis before we vote, he said. Not a second assessment field report, a proper behavioral study. I want someone who specializes in this to look at everything Val 9 found and tell me what this species does when it is backed into a corner. Not what it has done historically in internal conflicts, what it does when the enemy is external, when it is not fighting itself but fighting something else. Dren nodded slowly. That will take time. That is fine, Kethsorn said. They are pre-stellar. They are not going anywhere, he paused. Not yet, he added. The vote to proceed on the accelerated timeline failed, 3 votes to 7. The vote to commission a full behavioral study passed unanimously. The session ended. The council members filed out. Voss Elthen left without looking at anyone. Pelvon stopped at the door and turned and said, to nobody in particular, Hannah, the children's song was the worst part, and then left before anyone could respond. Sarath was the last to leave. She had been the oldest person in the room by 600 years, and she had the habit of moving slowly, not because she was weak, but because she had decided at some point that fast was for things that were afraid of being late. She paused next to Keth Soren's chair on her way out. She did not look at him. She looked at the blank screen where the documentary had played and the nursery song had played, both of them saying the same thing from completely different directions. We conquered my homeworld when I was 19, she said. I was one of the resistors. I fought for 11 years. She paused. I ran out. Keth Soren said nothing. I wonder, she said, still looking at the blank screen. What would have happened if I hadn't? She left. Keth Soren sat alone in the council room for a long time after that. He did not have a weapon. He was not on a bridge or a battlefield or any place where a decision needed to be made right now. He was in a room with an empty table and a blank screen, and outside the room was an organization he had served for his entire adult life. And further outside, that was a galaxy full of worlds the Dominion had decided needed to be ordered. And further out than that, somewhere past the reach of any of it, was a blue planet he had never seen in person, pouring its millions of signals into the dark, including the one about a child who fell and got up and fell and got up. That's what we do. He stood up eventually. He picked up the report and his notes and put them in their folder with precise and careful movements. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. He thought about the one question he had asked that nobody had answered. Have we ever proceeded against something that we genuinely could not predict? He walked out. Down the corridor, in his office, a new file was already waiting on his desk. The xenosociological research request had been assigned. The analyst was good. He had read her work before. She was young and precise and proud of her ability to find the pattern in anything. He hoped she found one. He was not sure she would. Researcher Sane had a theory for everything. This was not arrogance. This was the product of 15 years of xenosociological study, the careful building of a mental framework so thorough and so tested that when a new species crossed her desk, she could, within an hour of reviewing the data, sketch the basic outline of their behavioral logic. Not the details. The details always varied, always needed careful research. But the skeleton, the bones. Every intelligent species was, at its core, running the same program. The program was survival. The details were just how they had arranged themselves around that core. Some prioritized group survival over individual survival. Some were the opposite. Some used dominance hierarchies. Some used distributed networks. Some developed complex moral systems to justify their survival behaviors. Some didn't bother. The surface could look wildly different from one species to the next, but if you stripped it back far enough, you always found the same thing underneath. Survival logic. She had never been wrong about this. 15 years. Dozens of species studied in depth, and the skeleton was always there. She received the Earth assignment on a morning like any other morning. She read the file summary over a drink of something warm, and then read it again, and then set down the drink and moved to her main workstation, because this was going to need both hands. She spent the first 3 days doing what she always did, building the framework before she looked at the evidence. This was her method. You built the model first, based on general species parameters, biology, evolutionary environment, social structure, technology level, and then you tested the model against the data. The model told you where to look. The data confirmed or adjusted. It was elegant and it worked. The model she built in those first 3 days said, high aggression internal species, or tribal social structure, high variance in individual behavior, suggesting incomplete evolutionary homogenization. Currently in a consolidation phase, typical of pre-stellar civilizations, approaching their first major technological threshold. The behavioral prediction that came from this model was, under external threat, the species will demonstrate initial disorganized resistance, followed by gradual consolidation around shared identity. Resistance will be intense but unsustainable due to internal divisions. Estimated subjugation timeline, 7 to 12 cycles with moderate force application. She liked this model. It was clean. It accounted for all the key variables. It matched the profile she would have predicted from the basic parameters. She opened the archive. The model lasted 4 hours. The specific thing that broke it was not the wars. She expected the wars. The model had accounted for high internal aggression. The specific thing was what happened during the wars. She was reviewing a record from the Second World-scale conflict, specifically looking at the social cohesion data, specifically looking for evidence of the fractures that her model predicted would make the species easier to divide. She found the fractures easily. They were everywhere. They ran deep. The conflict lines were complex and old and had been building for generations. The model was holding. Then she found the records of the prisoners, specifically the records of what happened to prisoners in the water. Ships going down, men in the sea, enemy soldiers, not allies, not neutral parties, soldiers from the opposing force, men who had been trying to kill the people now in the water, being pulled out by the other side, being kept alive, being fed. She ran the frequency data to see how often this happened. The frequency was not trivial. She ran it against standard prisoner recovery data from other species in comparable conflict situations. In every comparable conflict, across every species she had studied, you found some examples of prisoners being preserved. Not out of compassion, but out of tactical logic. Prisoners had value, information value, exchange value. The calculus was clear, and it was survival logic. The same program running underneath, just arranged differently. The calculus here did not work that way. She could not find the survival logic in pulling an enemy out of the water in the middle of a war and keeping him alive at cost to yourself and feeding him and recording his name and sending him home after. She could not find the tactical benefit. She ran it through 3 different frameworks and all 3 returned the same error. No clear survival benefit identified. She put the prisoner data aside and kept going. Model 1 was broken. She deleted it and started Model 2. Model 2 was built on a different foundation, tribalism as the primary driver. This was a backup framework she used for species where the first model didn't hold, typically species with strong in-group/out-group dynamics. The prediction changed. Under external threat, the species will unify against the shared external enemy, temporarily suppressing internal divisions in favor of species-wide survival response. Cohesion will be strong, but fragile. Once the immediate threat is neutralized, internal divisions will reassert. Better, more flexible. She had used this model successfully before. She tested it against the disaster data. The disaster data was extensive. This species had a remarkable catalog of catastrophic events, geological disasters, weather events, industrial accidents, disease outbreaks, decades of data. She looked at the behavioral patterns during and after each event. The in-group response was there, exactly as predicted. Communities organizing around shared need, resources being directed toward recovery, short-term suppression of internal social conflicts in favor of collective action. But the out-group response did not match. When in a clean tribalism model, you helped your in-group. You did not help your out-group during a crisis, or if you did, you helped them with a specific expectation of return, a clear survival benefit. She found record after record of what the species called international aid. Resources sent across the world from one nation to another nation that had experienced a disaster. Often from wealthy nations to poor ones. Often from nations that had been in armed conflict with the recipient nation within living memory. No clear expectation of return. No formal treaty obligation. Just the disaster happened and other parts of the species sent help. Not every time, not uniformly. The pattern had failures and contradictions and cases where the help was too slow or too small or came with conditions that undermined the point of it. And she noted all of that. The failures were real. The model was not completely wrong, but the help kept happening anyway. Through the failures, around the failures, even when it didn't work the way it was supposed to, even when the politics were complicated and the resources were wasted, even when the help arrived too late, even then, the next disaster, the transmissions would go out and the resources would start moving. She deleted Model 2. Model 3 was built on pure conflict analysis. If tribalism didn't explain it, maybe the conflict itself was the primary driver. A species that had been in continuous warfare had organized its social logic entirely around the fight. Model 3 prediction: a high-conflict species organizes all other social behavior around the conflict dynamic. Resources, relationships, meaning, all filtered through the lens of opposition. Introduce a new opposition, and the species will organize around it completely and instinctively. This one lasted the longest, 2 days. It broke on the literature. She had not reviewed the cultural production data yet. The art, the writing, the music. The things the species made not because they were useful, but because they needed to make them. She had been saving it for depth analysis once she had the behavioral framework established. She went into it now looking for evidence of the conflict as core logic that Model 3 predicted. She found conflict, yes, everywhere. The conflict was in everything. The violence and the war and the opposition were woven through the entire cultural output in ways that confirmed the model. But the cultural output also contained something else in quantities she had not expected. Love stories, not rare, not peripheral, central, enormous in volume, spanning every format, every era of broadcast history, every region of the planet. A species that spent this much of its energy on conflict also spent this much of its energy on attachment, on the specific state of being deeply, permanently connected to another member of the species, to the point where their well-being became inseparable from your own. She ran the volume comparison. The love stories and the war stories appeared in almost identical proportions across the archive. She sat with this for a long time. Model 3 said the species organized everything around conflict. And the data said the species organized everything around conflict and also organized everything around deep mutual attachment simultaneously with equal energy. These were not opposite things the way the model treated them. They were running in parallel, both present, both real, neither one canceling the other out. A species that fought with this much commitment and loved with this much commitment. At the same time, she deleted Model 3. She built and destroyed Models 4 and 5 in a single day. Model 4 tried to frame the species as purely self-destructive, the high aggression as a death drive, an evolutionary dead end that would have ended itself if not for the intervention she was being asked to prevent. Model 4 broke on the survival data, which showed a species that also fought for its survival with the same ferocity it brought to every other fight. Model 5 tried to frame it as a species in permanent adolescence, intelligent enough to build complex civilization, not mature enough to organize it stably, caught in a developmental phase that the Dominion's arrival might actually resolve by providing external order. Model 5 broke on the space program data. A species in arrested development did not reach the stars in 70 years from its worst catastrophe. She sat at her workstation in the early hours of the 6th day and looked at the empty framework where a model should be. She opened the raw intercept feed, the live transmissions, current, what the species was broadcasting right now today. She had been working from archived data for the whole study. If she needed to hear the current signal, she found it immediately. A single individual broadcasting on a low-frequency band that the analysis team had flagged as unusual. Not a government broadcast, not a media channel. A single person with apparently personal transmission equipment, sending a signal outward from a location the deep scan placed in a region they called a desert. She ran the translation. The individual was She checked, calling out to anyone who might be listening, not in distress, not asking for help, just reaching outward, into space, into the dark, asking if anyone was there. The message was structured as a greeting. It used mathematical patterns, prime numbers, geometric sequences, as an opening, as a way of showing that whoever was sending it was intelligent and intended communication. And then, after the mathematical opening, a second section, just words. If you are out there, if you can hear this, we are here. We have been here for a very long time. We have made a mess of things sometimes. We are working on it. If you are friendly, we would very much like to know about you. We would like to know that we are not alone. She read this 3 times. She thought about the archive she had spent 6 days moving through. The wars, the disasters, the weapons, the children's songs, the love stories, the self-sacrifice, the failure, the recovery, the 70-year gap between catastrophe and space. All of it. And somewhere in a desert, someone who lived in the middle of all of that, who had access to the same archive she had been studying, who knew the history, who had seen what the species was capable of at its worst, was pointing a transmission at empty space and hoping something friendly was out there. She looked at the wall for a while, then she started writing her report. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping, and then deleted everything and started over. The first draft had been, she realized, an attempt to still build a model. She had been describing the species through frameworks, trying to contain it in analytical language, trying to find the skeleton underneath the way she always found the skeleton. She started the second draft differently. She wrote it in plain language. She described what she had found. She did not reach for frameworks. She described a species that had been at war with itself for 11,000 years and never once, in that entire time, was stopped trying to help a stranger in distress. She described a species that had looked at its own worst moments and archived them and broadcast them to its children, not to traumatize them, but because it believed that looking at the worst things you had done was how you tried, sometimes failed, but tried, to do better. She described a species that could not be modeled because the thing underneath all its behaviors was not survival logic. It was something that did not have a clean name in any language she knew. It was the specific combination of being capable of enormous destruction and being unable to stop caring anyway. It was the impulse to pull the enemy out of the water, even during the war. It was the person in the desert sending greetings into the dark and meaning it. Here she wrote 4 sentences where the conclusion was supposed to be, and looked at them for a long time. I cannot build a predictive model for this species. Every framework I apply, they have already exceeded in both directions simultaneously. The only accurate statement I can make is this. They have never in 11,000 years of recorded history encountered a problem and decided it was permanent. She looked at these 4 sentences. She thought about the thing that had been sitting in the back of her mind for 6 days, the thing she had been trying to find a professional way to say. She opened a personal notes section at the bottom of the report, the kind of section that was technically optional, that she had never once used in 15 years of writing reports. She typed quickly before she could change her mind. Oh, I think we should not go there. I think we should send the greeting back. She stared at what she had written. She thought about Keth Sorn's question that had been passed to her in the assignment brief. What does this species do when the enemy is external? When it is not fighting itself, but fighting something else? The archive had answered this clearly. She had almost missed it because she had been looking for the behavioral prediction, not the pattern. But the pattern was there if you looked at the full sweep of it. All the disasters, all the external threats, all the moments when the species had faced something that was not internal, not one of its own fractures, not one of its own conflicts. It unified, not perfectly, not without complications, not without some portion of the species doing something counterproductive, because this species always had some portion doing something counterproductive. But the core response, the thing it did in its bones, the skeleton underneath, was to unify. 11,000 years of fighting itself, and it had not, in all that time, managed to fully destroy itself. 70 years from catastrophe to space. A person in a desert sending a greeting into the dark, hoping for a friend. She thought about what the species would do if instead of a friend, it found the thing that had been watching from behind a gas giant and deciding whether to end it. She pressed the personal note into the report and saved it. She sat at her workstation and looked at the live feed and found the desert signal still transmitting, still going outward, patient and regular as breathing. If you are out there. She was out there. She closed the feed. She submitted the report. She sat in her office in the quiet and thought about the species that had never once encountered a problem and decided it was permanent, and thought about what it would mean to be the problem they decided to solve, and felt, for the first time in 15 years, that she was glad she was just the researcher, that the decision was someone else's, that it belonged to Keth Sorn, who had fought 200 campaigns and still wanted to understand something before he moved against it. She hoped he read the personal note. She hoped he read it and thought about the person in the desert. She hoped the council understood that this species was not the kind of problem you solve from orbit in a clean operation with acceptable parameters. She hoped they understood what the data was actually saying in all its contradictory, unmodelable, slightly irrational weight. She had told them, clearly, 4 sentences and a personal note. She had done what she could. She turned off her workstation. She put on her coat. She walked out of her office and into the corridor and stopped for a moment because the corridor had windows, and through the windows was the night sky, and the night sky was full of stars, and one of them, invisible from here but real, was a yellow dwarf with a blue planet turning around it. She stood at the window for a moment, then she walked home. She did not send the greeting, but she thought about it for a long time. She thought about it for the rest of her life. Sergeant Dana Reyes had been on the overnight shift for 3 nights in a row. And this was not unusual. This was, in fact, the shape of the job. U.S. Spacecom's Signal Monitoring Station 7 sat in the high desert of New Mexico, which meant big sky and bad coffee, and a whole lot of nothing happening between midnight and 6 in the morning. She had been doing this for 6 years. She knew the rhythm of it. The equipment ran its sweeps. The data came in. The data was mostly nothing. She documented the nothing. And at 6 a.m., someone brought fresh coffee and took over, and she drove the 20 minutes back to the base housing and slept until noon. She was good at the job. That was the honest truth, and she would say it plainly because the kind of people who were bad at this job did not stay at this job. Sitting in a monitoring room in the high desert at 2 in the morning required a specific kind of person. You had to be comfortable with the silence. You had to be comfortable with the nothing. You had to be able to look at 6 hours of flat data, night after night, and not convince yourself something was there when it wasn't. Reyes was comfortable with the silence. She had grown up with it. Small town, northern New Mexico, the kind of place where the nearest city was 2 hours away, and the sky at night was so dark and so full of stars that when she was 8 years old, she had asked her grandmother what was out there, and her grandmother had said, "Everything that has ever been or ever will be, mija, and it is not finished yet." She had been trying to find it ever since. The podcast she had playing in her left ear was about a disputed archaeological site somewhere in the Pacific. She was not listening to it closely. It was background noise, the kind of company you keep when you are alone in a room at 2 in the morning and the equipment is doing the work and there is nothing to do with your hands. She had cold coffee. She considered reheating it. She decided against it. Cold coffee was the correct punishment for not drinking it while it was hot. She had principles. The sweep ran. The data came in. She scanned it. The sweep ran again. More data. She scanned it. On the third sweep, something was different. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of different that hits you immediately and makes you sit up and shout. The kind of different that you register in the corner of your eye first. A number in the wrong column. A pattern that breaks the pattern. She had been looking at this data for 6 years and she knew what the normal pattern felt like. And this did not feel like the normal pattern. She pulled the earbud out. She pulled the anomaly up on her main screen and looked at it. A signal. Incoming. Not from Earth. She checked the origin point immediately because there were a lot of ways to get a false positive on a reading like this, and the first thing you did was eliminate the obvious ones. Not a satellite. Not a probe. Not any registered spacecraft. She checked the orbital registry, She checked the known deep space assets. She checked every piece of human-made hardware that could possibly be broadcasting on this frequency from this direction. Nothing. She checked again. Still nothing. The signal was structured. This was what made her hands go still on the keyboard. Random signals were not structured. Interference was not structured. Equipment noise was not structured. Or this signal had a pattern to it. Not random noise, but something with internal regularity, something that repeated with intent, the kind of pattern that did not happen by accident. She ran the diagnostic sequence. She ran it again. She ran it a third time because the third time is the one that counts, because the first one you might be wrong, and the second one you might be seeing what you want to see, and the third one is usually the truth. The diagnostic came back clean. The signal was real. Her hands were steady. She was aware of this. The steadiness in the way you are aware of things about yourself in strange moments. The way the body sometimes decides to be exactly right when everything else is exactly wrong. She picked up the internal line and called her supervisor. He answered on the fourth ring, which meant he had been awake but not at his desk. She told him what she had, using precise language. No unnecessary words. He said he'd be there in 3 minutes. He was there in 2. He looked at the screen. He ran his own diagnostic. He called his supervisor. His supervisor called her supervisor's supervisor. And then it went higher than that, and within 40 minutes, the room that seated 8 held 14 people. And the coffee problem had been solved because someone had brought 3 full pots and nobody was thinking about cold coffee anymore. The signal was still there. It was still structured. The frequency analysis team had been pulled in, and they were going through it layer by layer. And what they were finding was this. The structure was mathematical. Not randomly mathematical. Specifically, deliberately mathematical. Much prime numbers first, the simplest possible signal that could only be produced by something that understood mathematics, which meant something that thought, which meant something that chose to send this. Someone was saying hello. Not in those words, not yet. Translation was a different department, a different problem, a problem for later. But in the most basic possible sense, in the language underneath all languages, the language of pattern and sequence that only intelligence produces. Hello, we are here. We are thinking things. We thought you might want to know. The room was very quiet for a group of 14 people who had just received the most significant signal in human history. Israel sat at her console and looked at the data and thought about all the nights she had sat in this room with cold coffee and a podcast and the sweep running its clean, empty cycles, and thought about how all of those nights had been, without her knowing it, the nights before this night. Her supervisor was on the phone. His supervisor was on a different phone. Someone in the corner was already pulling up the formal protocol, the document that U.S. Spacecom had written and revised and rewritten over the years. The document that described in careful language what you were supposed to do if this ever happened. She could hear him reading sections of it to someone else. She turned back to her screen. She had been running secondary analysis on the signal while the room filled up around her. In the mathematical section she understood and had already mapped. It was straightforward once you knew to look for it. But there was a second section, after the mathematics, after the structured pattern that said, I am intelligent and I am here, there was a second section that was different. More complex, not mathematical. She had been working on it for 20 minutes. The signal was not in any human language. Obviously, she had not expected it to be. But it had structure, and structure was something, and structure that repeated in consistent ways was something more. She was not a linguist. She was not the person in this building with the most expertise in signal analysis. But she was the person who had been sitting at this console for 6 years, and she was the person who had pulled the signal up first, and she was the person who knew this frequency the way you know a road you have driven 1,000 times in the dark. She worked at it. The room around her was getting louder. More phones, more voices. The chain of command was moving upward at speed that she had never seen this building move. And the word was spreading through that chain in the way big words spread, and she could hear it in the voices. The specific tone of people who are trying to stay calm and professional about the thing that they have spent their entire careers preparing for. The thing they had secretly started to believe would not happen in their lifetimes. And the second section of the signal had a texture to it that she was beginning to understand. It was not identical to human language, but it was organized in ways that mapped onto the organization of language. Units that clustered, patterns that repeated, breaks that functioned like the breaks between words. Something that was trying to say something to something else. Something that had looked at the problem of talking to a stranger across an enormous distance and tried to solve it. She could not translate it. She was clear on that. This was not a translation. This was a read, an impression, the way you get an impression from the shape of something before you understand the details. The impression was, "We see you." She sat with that for a while. The room was very loud now. Someone was reading protocol aloud. Someone else was arguing about who had authorization to do what and in what order. The formal response message was apparently being drafted by a committee that was going to draft it very carefully and revise it 13 times and make sure it reflected the full weight and dignity of humanity's first response to contact. Reyes thought about the full weight and dignity of humanity. She thought about 6 years in a monitoring station in the high desert, hoping something would answer. She thought about the whole long history of people pointing dishes at the sky and listening, all those years, all those empty sweeps, the patience of it. She thought about her grandmother. Everything that has ever been or ever will be, mija, and it is not finished yet. The committee was going to take hours. The authorization was going to take hours. The response that came out the other end was going to be correct and careful and measured and was going to say exactly the right things in exactly the right way, and it was going to represent humanity in a way that made the committee feel good about what they had done. Reyes looked at her secondary board. The secondary board was her board. It was a backup transmitter. Lower power than the main array, used for test signals and calibration, not connected to the main authorization chain because it was not the main system. Nobody in this room was watching it. Everyone in this room was watching the main system, watching the screens where the incoming signal was still playing, watching each other. She was watching her secondary board. She pulled up the raw frequency. She typed the coordinates of Earth, their exact coordinates, are precise and clean, the numbers that said here, this is exactly where here is. She put them in the transmission field. She thought about whether to send them alone. She decided not to. Below the coordinates, she typed 4 words. She looked at them for a moment. She sent it. She put her hands back on the main console and went back to the primary analysis like nothing had happened. And the room was too busy and too loud and too full of people on phones for anyone to notice the small light on the secondary board that meant a transmission had gone out. And by the time anyone checked the secondary board logs, 3 hours later, the transmission was already moving outward at the speed of light. 4 words. The coordinates of Earth, moving out into the dark. The formal response went out at 6:17 a.m. 14 paragraphs. Approved by committee, reviewed by the chain of command all the way to the top. Careful and measured and correct in every way. It went out 23 seconds after Reyes handed over the console to the morning shift and walked to her car. The morning was cold and clear. The desert was orange and purple in the early light. She stood at her car for a moment and looked up at the sky. Big sky, the same sky she had grown up under, the same sky her grandmother had pointed at. Still full of stars, fewer visible now in the rising light, but still there. Still there in their billions past the blue. One of them was a little closer now. One of them had a ship behind it, she believed, or something behind it. She was something that had sent a signal that said, "We see you," and she had sent one back that said, "Here is exactly where we are," and 4 more words that she stood by completely, that she would stand by if anyone ever asked, that she would explain if explanation was required, though she did not think the words required explaining. They were very simple words. They were the simplest words she knew for the thing she meant. On the other side of the galaxy, in the shadow of a slow-turning gas giant, a ship received both transmissions within seconds of each other. First, the formal one. 14 careful paragraphs, weighted and measured, representing humanity as a civilization trying to make a good first impression. Then the second one, smaller, lower power, 4 words below a set of coordinates. The analyst who received them sat with them for a long time. He had been sitting in the shadow of the gas giant for a considerable while now. He had submitted his report. He had sent his warning. He had watched the blue planet turn for hours and days until he had lost count of the turns. And somewhere in that time, he had stopped seeing the planet as an assessment target and started seeing it as, he did not have a clean word for what he had started seeing it as. He read the formal response first. It was impressive in its way, thorough, careful. It said all the correct things. He could see the committee in it, the multiple hands, the multiple revisions, the collective desire to put the best possible face on what they were, which was, to be fair to them, very complicated. Then he read the 4 words, "Henry, come find us." He sat with those words for a long time. He thought about the children's song and the nursery rhyme and the 11,000 years, and the man in the middle of the night who had felt something was wrong and not pressed the button. He thought about the person in the desert sending greetings into the dark. He thought about those 4 words, "Come find us." Not, "Please do not hurt us." Not, "We mean you no harm." Not, "We come in peace," which was the phrase most species used in first contact scenarios when they were frightened and trying to diffuse a situation they did not understand. Come find us. As if the finding was the interesting part. Soon as if the invitation was not diplomatic strategy, but genuine desire. The desire of something that had been alone for a very long time and had never once stopped believing that the universe was full of things worth meeting. He did something he had not done in 412 assessments. He laughed. It was not a comfortable laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had been sitting in the dark for a long time, waiting to be surprised, and had been surprised in the specific way where you already knew it was coming, but it hits you fully anyway. He opened a new transmission to High Command. Not the formal report, not the warning. Something different. He wrote, "I have received first contact response from the target species. Formal message attached. I am also attaching a secondary transmission, unofficial, low power, and sent separately from the formal response." He paused. "I recommend the Council read the secondary transmission before making any further decisions." He paused again. "I recommend they read it more than once." He attached both transmissions and sent it. Then he did something else, something not in the protocol, not in the procedure, not in any guidance document he had ever been given in his career. He composed a response to the secondary transmission. Not official, not from the Dominion. Just from him, sitting in the dark behind a gas giant, having spent a long time looking at the blue planet and having come to a conclusion that he had not been trained to reach. He wrote, "Transmission received. Coordinates noted. We have found you." He paused. "Message to follow." He sent it. He sat back and looked at the blue planet. It was still blue, still turning, still loud with its millions of signals going in every direction, still telling its history to anyone who would listen, still sending its greetings into the dark, still teaching its children that falling was not the end of the story. That's what we do. Whatever came next, whatever the Council decided, whatever happened when 2 civilizations who did not speak the same language and had never met stood at last on either side of the same empty space and looked at each other. Whatever that was going to be, he did not know. But he knew what was on the other side of that distance. He had read the archive. He had read the history. He had sat in the dark for days looking at a species that had never once, in 11,000 years, decided that a problem was permanent. Sarn he had sent, "Message to follow." He meant it. He had a great deal to say. He was not afraid of saying it. Outside the window, the gas giant turned its slow rings and the blue planet turned below, and the stars were enormous and everywhere. And somewhere in the dark between all of them, moving at the speed of light, were 4 words and a set of coordinates. Come find us. It was not a threat. It was not a plea. It was just the most honest thing a species had ever said about itself, compressed to 4 words, sent by a sergeant on the overnight shift with cold coffee, and a principle about not reheating it. The galaxy had marked the planet. The planet had sent back its address. The galaxy was still deciding what to do about that. The planet was not waiting. The planet was never waiting. That was the thing about the planet. It never waited.